Look at that. It's beautiful. A sculpted work of art, really. And beautiful not only in its slender shape and gracefully turning blades, but in what it represents. Clean energy, freedom from fossil fuels, a path to a livable planet for my 3 sons. It's a 21st century monument to human progress, an unqualified good, right? That's what I believed. I'm a dad, a husband, a teacher, and when it comes down to it, just another guy who expects those electrons to flow reliably and cheaply through the outlets in my Vermont home. I have to admit, the first time I heard news of communities in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom resisting the construction of wind projects near their homes, I was a bit baffled. I thought, there goes the NIMBY beast, rearing its ugly head again. Some Vermonters just didn't want the view out their kitchen window changed. Why couldn't they see that wind turbines are beautiful and about something much, much bigger than their precious view? I decided to hit the road and find out. How could something so seemingly benign be so controversial, especially in our little green state of Vermont? Was there more to this story than I assumed? What I found is that there's a much bigger question at play here than simply wind energy, good or bad. In the face of climate change and the urgent need for action, the real issue here is, how do we as a state take bold steps toward our clean, renewable energy goals in a way that protects our ecosystems and our natural beauty, preserves our traditions of local democratic decision-making, and just is in character with all that we love about Vermont? The good news is, Vermont takes climate change seriously. We lead the nation in our efforts to create efficiency and renewable energy, and the Vermont legislature began efforts back in 2005 with a program that required 1% of energy sold in the state to come from renewables. The percent increases each year with the ambitious goal of 90% of all energy from renewable sources by the year 2050. That is where this story begins.
The sun converts 5 million tons of matter into energy every second. This energy from nuclear reactions within the sun is sent out into the solar system as light and heat. The Earth receives only a small part of this energy, which we see and feel in different ways. As the sun warms the Earth, the air is also warmed. The warm air rises and cool air rushes in below, causing the conversion of sunlight into another form of solar energy, wind.
When I look at how our climate has changed since I was a kid, it's remarkable. If you think about it, we used to have snow in the wintertime. It was predictable every single year. 2 years ago, we had over 4 million skiers come to Vermont to help support jobs in our economy. Last winter, because of the warm climate, that dropped to 3 million skiers. It never got cold enough to have a good ski season.
I think we all agree that global warming is a real thing now. The less fossil fuels we burn, the less impact we're having on global warming. So it seems to me that we have to make an investment. We as a planet have to make an investment to begin to thwart global warming.
If I were to take as a starting point of what is a common goal, more or less across the political spectrum, although there are some who I think whose heads are in the sand, but it's not a lot of people in Vermont, is that people believe that the climate is changing and that collectively we need to do something about it.
As a state that understands the importance of this issue, I believe we've got a responsibility to act.
Like President Kennedy said to the United States back in the early 60s, we're going to put men in the moon by the end of this decade.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Most anybody in the space program said, this guy is absolutely crazy. We do not have the technology, we don't have it, we can't do it. But you set the vision, and we did it. And we end up doing it because you have to set the big picture vision, and that's what the whole energy change is about.
So a lot of what's happened with energy here in Vermont has really, it started here in the State House in about 2005, and the whole goal was to just build. It didn't matter, and nothing mattered except just build. We had to create incentives to get energy projects built.
I think if you set a goal, you should have a path to get there. And our governor just set a goal with no path and just left it as a free-for-all and set up the structure for them to just go after it any way they pleased.
What have we done in 6 years? We have 11 times the number of solar panels in this state that we had when I took office. 11 times. We have 22 times the amount of wind power that we had in this state when I took office.
So it's all been about build, build, build. Well, there's so much more to the conversation than that.
We're going to have to do something. The opponents are saying, just not here. Then the question is where? They say somewhere else.
I'm certainly not opposed to wind. I know in my heart that wind is a big solution for major parts of this country. I'm just not convinced they're a solution for Vermont's steep terrain.
I don't think that is morally correct to say we will simply move these impacts to somebody else because we don't want them.
And when you have a very powerful and politically connected person like David Blittersdorf coming into your community and saying, you have to take this because it's a moral responsibility we have, and you know, somebody has to sacrifice. One of the most painful views I got of this was the public hearing for the Georgia Mountain Wind Project. And it was a packed gymnasium, and half the people who didn't live there said, we have to sacrifice to save the planet. And then there were the people who lived there who said, please don't sacrifice us.
That's partly the way the industry has framed it, that if you're resisting the industrial projects, you're against renewables totally. And it's not a simple question like that.
I do agree that it's an urgent need that takes, that will require urgent actions now. But I just feel that in Vermont's case, rather than sacrificing our rather limited wildlands and wildlife habitat, that we really ought to be investing in the appropriate research to figure out how we can do it in a state like Vermont and still be truly green.
And when you hear folks say, let's take a pause, we're moving too fast, I say, ask the ski areas whether we can slow down. Ask anyone under the age of 25 whether they think we can slow down. We've created an extraordinary mess, burning oil and coal with irrational exuberance. It's now our responsibility to do everything we can to move quickly to get off of fossil fuels. And there's no better way to do it than energy efficiency, which Vermont is doing right, than building out solar, which Vermont is doing right, and building out wind in the right places, which Vermont is doing right. So anyone who thinks that we don't have to move as quickly as we can to get off of coal, to get off of oil, and to move to renewables is living in denial.
It was one of the first hints suggesting that young people were beginning to care as much about the environment as they do about the peace movement and civil rights. Their dream for the age of Aquarius was to let the sunshine in. Let the sunshine in.
They co-opted terminology environmentalists had used in the 60s and 70s about getting off fossil fuels, using sources of energy that are perpetually renewable, like wind and solar. But they developed an industrial scale technology that is the opposite of what those terms were originally being used for.
Ideology. I think it's, you know, it's this idea that we've got to do something to address global warming, and in fact, we really are not accomplishing much of anything.
The amount of carbon it takes to produce these large monsters and to bring them and transport them and put them up, it just doesn't equate.
They say they're green, but to build them, it takes tremendous amounts of fossil fuels to build them. And then all the cement, each pound of cement is so much carbon. Plus, all those natural carbon sequesters up there right now, all those trees, they're taking that carbon out nice and naturally right now, taking those down. So you're at a huge deficit when you start.
So we're destroying something very significant as we put these things up. And it's a little bit like the My Lai thing where we got to wipe out the village to save it. That's not a very good solution to me.
Are they really saving the planet? Because that's the assumption, right? I see a wind turbine and it's like, it shows we're doing something. It's symbolic.
It's not that it's an anti-wind position. It's just that that resource in this region does not have the necessary benefits relative to its impacts, and that there are much better alternatives.
If you're out in Kansas, the wind turbines on our better ridges in Vermont will probably outproduce those 2-to-1. The interesting thing about the Midwest is we have huge amounts of land. Our ridge lines are very energy productive for wind. It's just that we have very little amount of land.
This is the most environmentally fragile part of the area, and the total amount of wind generation that you can do on those ridges turns out to be a very small fraction of the electricity consumption in the eastern United States.
To do this energy future where wind is a big player, we're going to have wind turbines on many, many miles of ridgelines. I'm saying upwards to 200 miles of ridgeline.
The main problem with it is that if you covered all of the ridges in the eastern United States, you'd still be generating only a very small fraction of the power demand in this region.
Pause. To get any meaningful amount of our electricity from wind, we would essentially need to cover all of our ridgelines. And even that would only supply a small fraction of our power needs. As soon as I started talking to people, I could see that wind energy in Vermont really is a lot more complicated than I'd assumed. I've enjoyed a lot of time in these beautiful Green Mountains. I've spent days hiking their trails and nights sleeping in the shelters. The view from our rocky summits takes my breath away every time and gives me a comforting sense of place. But maybe that view needs to change. Mountaintops have been removed in Pennsylvania and West Virginia so that I could get my electricity. Isn't ridgeline wind energy still better than that? If we all want electricity to maintain our way of life, maybe we need to start seeing where it's generated. If we decided to really go for it, what would significant wind energy mean for the Green Mountain State? What are the pros and what are the cons?
Throughout our land, the once beautiful forests, such as this, have become scenes of desolation. The timber is gone, and so is the wild game which once was sheltered beneath its shade.
I came to the Northeast several years ago fully expecting to support ridgeline wind. I had worked very hard to get utility scale wind off the ground in New Mexico, so I really came to Vermont with an open mind about this. And when the first vote was taken on Lowell, I was actually optimistic that maybe a way had been found to find some societal consensus on this resource. But then I started to look at the environmental destruction associated with the projects, and I was pretty appalled by it. I was amazed at the level of blasting and bulldozing. I was actually quite disappointed that the renewable energy industry would consider such impacts acceptable and that wouldn't be working very, very hard to find a way to minimize those impacts.
When you go to the top of this ridgeline, or almost any ridgeline in the state, it's hard to describe, but up there, game trails, absolutely no tracks of any kind made by man. They claimed it had been logged off. They've never logged the top of that ridgeline.
I have Native American heritage, and to me, there's, I have to think of it in terms of living in a web of life. that as two-leggeds, as human beings, we don't tend to think of all the other life that actually sustains us and that we're part of.
The top of a ridgeline in the state of Vermont has a little bit of mystique to it. I don't know if everybody's the same, but when I look at a ridgeline, I always wonder about the top of that ridgeline.
For me, it's the destruction of the mountain. That is my sanctuary, and that if you actually take the tour, you will see what has happened up there. This whole mountain is just covered with springs and wetlands.
I know every time I go into high elevation wetlands, I'm floored by all manner of unique plant life, and they're very fragile. I mean, once they're messed up, they're messed up.
The amount of blasting and cutting they did on the mountain, exposed rock, exposed road, and seeing how hot and dry it is up there, I never expected to see that.
This project is really, it's hard to actually understand how large it is. I mean, these are 28 wind turbines that are 500 feet tall, so they're huge. In order to put these giant monsters up, there's incredible amount of devastation that has to occur.
Now is definitely the time to do better, because it's a crisis out there, what we're doing. I mean, I go all over North America, from the Arctic to Florida, and every place I go, ecosystems are in shambles because of what we've done. We can't keep this up. We've got to stop making excuses for our consumptive habits and change our ways.
The industry wants you to look at just the impact on the actual footprint. They want you to just look at their access road and just the site where the turbines are mounted. Actually, the amount of damage ripples out in a great circle around that, because you can't do anything in the web of life without affecting other threads of it and other areas of it much further out. That's a perspective that Native Americans would see, because it's all interconnected. You can't separate one little piece. It always affects all the rest.
They used somewhere between 3/4 of a million tons and 1 million tons of dynamite to blow a road and blow off the top of one of the mountains there. They drove the animals out.
We know that animals, birds and mammals alike, use ridgelines as travel routes to get from one place to another. So to disrupt that with still more human presence is incalculably destructive, I think.
A beech tree doesn't actually begin producing nuts until it's about 40 years old. So those are an important food source for the bears, and we were able to map over 130 trees like this, and it just so happens that all of them are concentrated right on the mountain tops where the turbines are proposed to be placed. We know that this is a very marvelous bear habitat.
Well, I have grave problems with the notion that we can introduce on our sensitive ridgeline habitats, high elevation, often steep habitats, still more roads and still more built infrastructure and fragmentation, what we call habitat fragmentation, and totally disallowing that any of that's going to have a negative impact on wildlife. That just doesn't work for me. That's not the truth.
Oh yes, that's one of the big stories, that all the wildlife will disappear. Well, from the evidence I've been around talking to people in other places, the deer are grazing directly below them. They don't even know they're there. They don't care if there's nice, good things to eat. Same with the bears. They might be a little disturbed by the noise, a little bit of whooshing sound going on, but they come back. Everybody says they come back.
The habitat grows back. The animals are very adaptable. I think the Searsburg project has been an excellent example. That is right in the middle of, or right near pristine bear habitat, and the bears have thrived. So.
One of the things that's disturbing about these projects is they won't tell you anything about the bat or bird kill. For example, if you went out to Tug Hill in New York or places like that, when they bring along a group of school children to take a look at the wind towers, and all the clean energy and stuff, they go out with shovels and scoop up birds the day before.
If I believed what I was being told by people who are opposed, I would expect to be wading through deep layers of dead birds and bats, and I've never seen that at any wind farm I've been to. It's
the air pressure. They don't look like they're going very fast, but it's several hundred miles an hour on the tips. And that's what's causing the change in air pressure. What it does is it explodes them on the interior. It's a decompression thing. It blows their chests apart inside.
When you see signs like we saw coming up here that say, you know, you got to watch out for the bears and watch out for the bats. Listen, I'll tell you one thing about this governor. I love our black bears and I love our bats, but I do not discriminate based on color. I like our polar bears too, and they're drowning because the ice cap is melting faster than the scientists ever thought it would. The bats are dying around the globe because, not despite, burning oil and coal.
Water is life, and we realize that there's a huge problem with water on the mountain.
If you just look at the footprint, you see a construction site. But if you start realizing that how a water system works, for instance, the natural water system, this mountain range is over 4 million years old. Well, in 6 months, they had clear-cut the trees all along the mountain range, and then they blasted, and they filled in wetlands, and they smoothed it out as much as they could. The way the water runs has been changed forever now. It's destroyed. So it's carrying silt from surface runoff because the streams no longer work the same way. The terrain has been changed enough at the top that the water funnels differently, so it's starting to cut new channels. This is going to affect the plant life. The plant life has everything to do with the insect life, with the birds, with the small animals, and then with the big animals. So it's going to change everything, and as it goes downstream, it goes into a river on either side. Those rivers are carrying more silt, and they're traveling, so they're going to be silting in wetlands and even lakes that they arrive at many, many miles away from that site.
I have visited the Lowell project. I know, for example, that one of the requirements of the certificate there is that the water quality is going to be better than it's ever been in 100 years by the requirement of the CPG.
The state has very, very high standards about that, and the developer will have to meet those standards.
They have, I think it's 10 monitoring sites around the watershed that Lowell feeds into, and in the last 2 to 3 years there have been, I think, one instance of very minor degradation of water quality.
We have the experts in the Agency of Natural Resources. It is not the mission of the Agency of Natural Resources to help a developer get a permit. It is the mission and philosophy of the Agency of Natural Resources to protect the environment, period.
I had to see for myself. I visited the Georgia Mountain Community Wind Site, not knowing what to expect. Anti-wind folks had made it sound like the entire mountaintop would be one massive slab of concrete, covered in heaps of bird and bat carcasses. Pro-wind folks made it sound like the ridge would be so natural and untouched that I'd have trouble even finding the turbines amongst the trees and the frolicking bears. What I found was something in between. Small gravel roads connected looming turbines, very little concrete, though around 35 acres of trees had been cleared, and I never saw an animal, either dead or alive. I couldn't help wondering, though, what had the top of this mountain been like before this energy project? Did Georgia Mountain have that mystique that Don Nelson referred to? Was it worth losing that? And, as I learned, folks living on Georgia Mountain and near other wind projects around the state have more on their minds than just Mother Nature. The plot thickens.
couple of days ago, you would have heard this thump, 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 and you would say, well, we're going to have to go in the house. So we go in the house, and you got the windows closed, right? And you still hear it, no matter what section of the house that you go into.
Comes right into our dooryard, and I'll walk out of the kitchen and around the corner into the dooryard, and it's like I'm getting hit. This is just a roar.
You can certainly hear in the background, you can hear that hum. And people come up here and they say, oh, this is not bad, you know, we could live with this. You can, if that's all it was. But what it does is it goes right through the building and it vibrates everything. My mother would sit next to the picture windows in there, and she'd say if I sit next to him or does the dishes on the back of the house, that it was like there was a constant tuning fork going off all the time.
Infrasounds are low frequency sounds that you cannot hear, but your body reacts to them. Someone equated that to, you know how when somebody opens the back window of your car and they don't open the front window and you get that thumping sort of feeling? Well, that's an infrasound, and that's something that these produce too. So they can send off the rhythms in your body. They can cause like migraines, they can send off your heart rhythms, and they really interrupt with sleep patterns.
It disrupts your cells, your body. It's when my kids would wake up at night crying, because what this does is it triggers a response system where you're in a panic mode, which would happen to me all the time. What do you do when you're in a panic mode? You're already sweating. I'm not going to sleep that night. My kids did not sleep that night. I have pictures of my kids where they're just devastated.
First time that I went up there and visited them was a year after the turbines had started operating, and the little boy was 3 years old, and he was a pretty busy kid, but not very vocal. And I was trying to figure out how to relate to him, and I was sitting on the sofa, and he got behind me, and I turned around and I said in a really happy voice, "So, Seeger, what's it like with the wind turbines?" It looked really sad. So then I said, well, so what about when you're sleeping? A little girl lived there for 3 years. She was born when the project first started up. She had slept through the night once the whole time. Seeger, who was a couple years older, had slept through the night until the wind turbine started up. Then he didn't want to stay in his bed anymore.
Since we moved to Derby, they don't wake up crying like they did here.
That's shameful. That is a black mark on the state of Vermont, and nobody has made it right to those people yet. And that's not okay.
That we would consider building something that would be that close to people, that it would hurt them in that way, it just is unconscionable to me.
We recently went to a school in Massachusetts that has 3 within a quarter mile. And we walked in and we said, okay, what do you think? You've had these here for several years now, and their response was, no, they don't bother anybody. We don't hear them, nobody cares, it's fine. And that was very, that was very reassuring.
I just got back a month ago from a tour out in the Midwest. We went past thousands of wind turbines. We came to a town called Ubli, and the town is surrounded. There must be 100 wind turbines around it. So we went into the town and stopped for gas and some ice cream and asked them, what was it like? Are people in problems? What's the problems? And I asked them all these questions, and they looked at me like I had grown a second head. And they said, what are you talking about? I said, we love them. In fact, we love them so much, we built 2 out by the school.
One of the things that we found most common among sound experts is that if you are predisposed against the noise, you will hear it far more than you might if you didn't care one way or another.
You have to be careful because people themselves can make themselves ill by just worrying about things. It's called psychosomatic. So how many of it actually is true? When a whole town that I stopped at, not a single person was ill, to the point where they actually built 2 of them right by the school, the elementary school. What does that say for everybody else's? Does everybody else come down with these great illnesses? I said, are the doctors swamped by ill people from the wind turbines? And they're going, what?
They just plain won't acknowledge the truth. We have to self-diagnose ourselves. I get to talk to people from Ireland to Australia, and we all have to diagnose ourselves because the medical community doesn't, you know, everything's okay. Well, you would think with enough people saying, look, this isn't okay, they would research it, but they don't.
There have been two very exhaustive studies, one done by the government of Australia, one done by the government of Canada. These are government, not biased, but rather government surveys. And both of them come to the conclusion that there is no direct health effects from this.
They're listening to 10-year-old studies, different turbines, smaller ones or whatnot, outdated research, and they believe in all that.
No one challenges the decibel level at which people lose sleep. That's agreed upon. And there are people throughout the world who are struggling with decibel levels that are higher than that. Their sleep is disturbed. And physicians have associated sleep disturbance with all manner of illness, including depression, heart disease, high blood pressure.
Those health concerns are, let's use the word anecdotal, okay? If there's 100,000 people surrounding an area and 7 or 8 of them end up with some sort of difficulty, then that's anecdotal, that's not widespread.
Dr. Ben Luce from Johnson State College hadn't been against them until he began seeing the effects of them in a mountainous terrain. And he began really sharing some negative kinds of things that the companies just deny, but he was doing it from a scientific viewpoint and realizing that the sound effects were different because the mountainous terrain funnels the sound differently, so that he felt it had a whole different impact than on the open plains of the Midwest.
What we have is 2 mountains right here. Everything's funneled right down to here.
The sound seems to gather strength as it comes down and bounces off the rocks and stuff around us and the topography, and it is a nightmare.
And that's what's hard in Vermont to measure sound. I think it was a location in Vermont where there were 2 houses side by side, and one family was very affected by the sound and one wasn't. And they studied it to try and figure out why. There was this little knoll in front of one of the houses. And what happened, the sound hit that and just and went right around that house. You know, they talk about like either 1 mile out, 2 miles out. Nobody knows what's a good buffer because of all the differences with the sound. This is a half a mile here, and then you've got the 1 mile here, you've got 134 houses.
And it turns out that there are 745 homes within the danger zone of 1.5 miles.
You have a lot of potential for a lot of people to be affected by this.
The wind company tried to buy us out, wanted to buy our 2 acres where we live, $45,000. I told them, I said, I can't move on that kind of money.
The Tyrians in Chatfield that actually abandoned their home because they couldn't live there because the sound was so disturbing to them and their children. And not much was done for them. The town didn't really do anything for them. The wind developer didn't do anything for them. They kept complaining and they kept asking for help. Finally, a Good Samaritan actually offered them enough money to find another place to live, and they had to abandon their property.
We ended up having to have people help us to get out of here.
Article 2 of the Vermont Constitution says that there may be times when we have to take land for the public good. And when that happens, that the landowner should be compensated. And none of that has happened.
Last I knew, Vermont had it in their constitution, no one should be able to invade my home and get away with it. Well, these guys are getting away with it.
Basically, he is encroaching on our properties with his sound. So we have the right to be able to enjoy our properties and be able to enjoy our homes without noise intruding.
I also have an underlying Vermont belief that an individual has the right to use his or her land as they see fit. This is private land that we're talking about developing. This is not a state forest or a national park or anything like that.
But I don't think you can just expect me to internalize the costs of a project like this, the noise, the aesthetic impact, the loss to the value of my property, which, you know, we had an appraisal done and they found that the house and 60 acres around it had been devalued by 37%.
There's no market for a place that will be affected by a wind farm.
You lose $80,000 to $100,000 probably off the sale of our home. And it's just not right.
You know, a lot of us have invested all our sweat equity into our homes. I mean, this was an old farmhouse that was ready to fall down when we bought it. And, you know, we are concerned about whether or not we'll be able to sell our house when it's time for us to move on.
Farmers don't put away a lot of cash, but we had a lot of land and we thought someday we would retire, and that the farm was really an investment in a business, and the future doesn't look very good for retirement.
For the average Vermonter, your home is your investment. And you know, you hope to pay it off, you hope to have it give you equity if you need it for health as you age and everything. And our homes are becoming unsellable. And that has been proven in you know, Ontario and Australia and other parts of the world.
It is my understanding of every study that we've ever seen that real estate values have not been proven to have been negatively impacted by any of these wind projects.
There have been some extensive studies. MIT and University of Massachusetts did a whole survey about property values and found no evidence that property values go down because of it.
This is where the question of wind energy in Vermont becomes so convoluted. Some studies say that the turbines have major health impacts. Some say they have none at all. Some say the syndromes come from infrasound. Some say they're just psychosomatic and come from exposure to anti-wind hype. One way or another, the negative experience some people have is very real to them. Is our march toward a green energy future worth, as Annette Smith said, sacrificing people? Does the increasingly negative perception of wind projects drive down both health and home values? Does that even matter when we're dealing with the future livability of our planet? I began to see that this debate around ridgeline wind energy is, at its heart, a debate about the character of Vermont. Who are we? What values do we hold dearest? Protecting the next generation from climate catastrophe? Preserving our wilderness and rural beauty? Caring for the health and quality of life of our people? And in a small state that prides itself on its town meetings, what about our long tradition of local democratic decision-making? I soon found that the development of wind energy in Vermont casts the very integrity of our democracy into the spotlight.
These big wind developers, in this case Iberdrola, have employed one of Montpelier's largest lobbying firms, KSE lobbyists. They are also lobbyists for Green Mountain Power. When we have had meetings here, the lobbyists and the lawyers descend upon us, and we've learned that they have a way of managing, you know, the entire past 4 years in how they're conducting this campaign. It's very carefully figured out.
The industry had done its homework for years with its propaganda, with it, they're very one-sided, and how perfect and wonderful this was.
Iberdrola has, you know, they canvass all the time. They send the lobbyists, they send their forestry guy. There's all kinds of editorials going out every day. They've started a WindWorks website, which they put up all kinds of information about wind turbines.
And there are certain consistencies. They go to particular organizations in town. They start meeting with people far before there's any public knowledge of the project. They'll peck off certain public officials rather than going straight to the select board. And so that way it's very divisive. Then comes the offer of the money.
The developer, Atlantic Wind, is offering a cash stipend each year as well as to pay taxes on the value of all those turbines. So that would be a cash influx, perhaps as much as 1/3 of our municipal budget. Think about what that does to property taxes.
You know, the truth of the fact is that, you know, it did reduce our taxes, and that's mostly what people in town voted for, was tax relief. It wasn't for a green renewable project.
Basically, what that boils down to is that as it stands right now, that would cover approximately 1/3 of your entire tax. In other words, it would basically cover the municipal part of your taxes.
So money divides as well. Some of us will say there is no amount of money you could offer us that would justify this horrendous, horrendous destruction. But other people are in different situations.
And that's part of the divide and conquer kind of thing that they are bringing out, to try to get people class-wise against each other.
Spirit of neighborly cooperation, a love of individual freedom inherited from the early settlers. Friendly people these, sincere in their civic obligations, good neighbors.
It is terribly divisive, terribly divisive. And I don't see a solution. I see people, no matter what the outcome is, whether there's turbines or not, that division is going to remain. You're not going to shake hands and say, oh, well, a good try, and go on about your life. It's going to be that way for a long time, unfortunately.
It's very disturbing to see. We live in a tiny town. We rely on each other. We need one another to help in times of trouble.
Frustration. There's anger. It has not gone away.
I'll tell you, those towers on that picture are grossly smaller than those towers actually will be. And you have people stand here and tell me you're driving this town.
There's resignation in a way, but there's also residual anger.
It's actually torn this town apart, and I think it's done the same in Windham. It's a rift that will not heal for many generations.
I feel so sorry for anyone that this happens to. We will never recover from this. It's an awful experience.
No more wind! No more wind! No more wind!
It's always struck me as fairly ironic that the people that are the most publicly sad about that are the people that are on the ground doing the divisiveness. It really is the opponents of wind power that have created most of those divisions that they then complain about.
When you're afraid, you tend to be a little more vocal than when you're not afraid.
This is classic NIMBY. I mean, you can't cover it up. It's a small group of people who all live out in the direction where the turbines will be, and they're all just determined that they're going to stop this from happening. They are absolutely classic, not in my backyard. Everybody agrees we can't go on as we are going on, or global warming will overcome us. And yet these folks think that just because they don't want it, it shouldn't happen.
In talking with the people at the Berkshire wind farm was probably one of the most divisive ones ever. And they're all just fine and dandy with each other. I mean, they were families pitted against families in that one. But I have a lot of faith in human nature that ultimately life's too short to stay mad, I hope. That would be my hope. You know, I think that's where democracy shines through at its brightest. You know, if you can navigate those divisive issues and come out of it still whole as a community, then that's when, you know, you've got something really good going on.
The Founding Fathers had a deep belief in the people of the United States. They believed that government should exist only to serve the people.
I think that the government in the state of Vermont is as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than the places that you hear about all the time, like Louisiana, like the gang-run state of Rhode Island. This is just run by another gang out of Burlington.
Industry has taken over the biggest part of our governing processes. So it's not really governing by the people who vote so much, it's governing by the corporations who then pay the money to the campaigns for the politicians who then do the favor for the corporations with the laws they pass. So it's a vicious cycle that way.
I mean, I've been a Democrat my whole life because I feel like I'm an environmentalist and I'm fighting to save the earth. And that's typically where the Democrats are. But on this issue, the Democrats are lining up with, well, this is green, and I feel like they're not looking into all the aspects of this and how this really is not green, and they're being driven by corporate money.
A rational approach to renewable energy policy development would be to systematically analyze what resources are available and develop a plan that would really move the region towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the most rapid and cost-effective and environmentally responsible way. That has simply not happened. Virtually all of the policy development has been driven by lobbyists working for various companies and pushing through proposals that will advance the agendas of those companies.
I believe that we should get all this money out of elections. And I am a very, very strong believer that lobbyists should not run the State House, and that citizens should be the ones who run it, not lobbyists, which has not historically been the way it goes down here. On the other hand, on an individual level, I'm not prepared to look at any of my colleagues and say, oh, he or she has made this decision because of a campaign contribution. That's why, you know, the integrity challenges are, I think, quite problematic because they're so opportunistic and cheap.
Certainly, the influence of money in politics is something that FIPRG is keenly aware of and absolutely fights to minimize. As far as the impact of that on renewable energy, relative to the overall impact of the money of the fossil fuel lobby in this country, again, we're talking a mountain versus a molehill. When we're talking about something that is so essential and which the impacts of which are so minor, as wind power, as solar power, as efficiency, I am significantly less concerned about the influence of those corporations over our democratic process than I am when we're talking about something like fossil fuels or the chemical industry.
This is all just a grab for money. And there are people that are convinced that since it's wind and wind is free and wind doesn't pollute, that it's good.
And yet behind the veil of, oh, we have to do something about global warming, oh, we have to reduce our carbon emissions. You can't stop renewable development. We're saving the planet. And that's the PR cover for what's essentially big business subsidized by the state and the federal government.
This is a system that is all gamed for the rich.
Vermont has created a guaranteed market for a very expensive product. So Vermont is paying more for this electricity than it would pay for other electricity that's available to us because the state requires utilities to buy this. We have a production tax credit that the federal government is paying for every kilowatt hour of electricity that Lowell produces. They get a tax credit.
In general, I support strong incentives for renewable energy. I fought for them very hard out in New Mexico, but sometimes incentives have the unfortunate effect of supporting projects that shouldn't happen as well as those that should. And there are, in this region, very few really strong environmental controls and controls to protect communities from inappropriate projects. So, of course, we therefore find ourselves in the situation where these incentives are driving this gold rush for inappropriate projects.
Those same incentives apply to all energy in the United States, whether it's wind, whether it's oil, whether it's solar. All of those have tax incentives and tax advantages, so there's no real difference.
Imagine mining coal under the ocean 5 miles from shore. Trains bring out more than 12 million tons a year. Coal carried direct to ships waiting at the docks.
You look at the 100-year-old sources that are still getting 60 times the amount of subsidies that the renewable sources are getting. It's absurd, but they're all getting subsidies.
In the United States, and certainly here in Vermont, we have a democratic process that is set up fairly well, not as well as it needs to be all the time, but fairly well to make sure that minority opinions have their day in the sun and are seriously considered. And when you look at wind in Vermont, that is absolutely the case.
It took various members of Georgia Mountain up to 77 calls total before the Public Service Board and the state official even responded to any of their complaints over a 3-year period. That's unacceptable.
My name is Reggie Johnson, and I live on Georgia Mountain, approximately 3,600 feet from the nearest turbine. This was not trained. As I open my sliders, it's the wind turbines with the tail end of the generator facing the house. It's obnoxious. It's a thunder.
I could probably deal with looking at these things, really. I'm beyond how they look. I just want to sleep. I want to enjoy my property.
I filed a noise complaint on December 24th of 2011 and have been trying to get the Public Service Board to essentially respond to that complaint ever since.
They have what they call intervenership if you want to participate in a process. So, you know, you go to the website, tells you fill out this form. So everything is legal type language. So you can put some verbiage, but you got to do it in a certain format and all that stuff that they like. So they gave us partial intervenership.
We worked our way through the whole process with the Public Service Board and commented and hired experts and did everything we could to try and mitigate the impacts of the project.
Since November 2002, when the first Met Tower was erected on Hardscrabble Mountain without a DSP permit, I have participated in every public service docket available to me.
Ultimately, its final order reflects the fact that we just well have saved our breath. I mean, it's like we hadn't even been there.
It's well over a year later. Nothing has been resolved in that issue. I've had to go to Montpelier and sit through a meeting where I was told that my voice didn't matter at all in the process. I'm like, well, wait a minute, why do I not matter?
That is a fairly difficult to access process, to know when and where things were happening and how they could participate, the kind of forms they needed to file, all of that stuff that's, you know, lawyers know by the back of their hand and your average Vermonter doesn't know anything about.
And we called the Department of Public Service, they're like, oh, you should get a lawyer. I'm like, well, why do I need to get a lawyer? I'm just trying to participate in this process.
And if you go to the technical hearings, that would blow your mind, because most of the people can't afford to hire lawyers, so they do it on their own, and you just get steamrolled every day.
And this is the hard part now with the whole Public Service Board process. It's a pay-to-play process. And now between Fairfield or Swanton, we're gonna have to raise like $150,000. We need to hire a lawyer. Everything is legalese terms. You have no say, no voice at the Public Service Board table.
The Lowell Mountains group spent, I think, the first year a little over $66,000, and that was without an attorney. We had a leader that was able to do all of the paperwork for the Public Service Board, which is extensive, because you have to have pre-filed testimony, then discovery, then there's a rebuttal. It's just unbelievable. I've got 2 trunks full of paperwork just from the project.
I mean, it's a stack of papers like this. They say it's gonna cost at least $100,000 for us to try and fight this, to just keep what we have. We're never gonna get anything out of it either way. We only lose.
They're raping us and getting away with it.
It was really, really hard to grasp the concept that nobody in the state cares about the people. The Public Service Department doesn't. The Department of Health will admit that turbine noise causes suffering, causes sleep disturbances, and all the health consequences that go along with that.
The interesting thing about being chair of the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, I get to experience people come in and they testify on every source of generation that you and I can think of, and there is an organized opposition group to absolutely every source of generation. And if we listen to everybody's good reason about why we shouldn't build these things, we wouldn't build a darn thing.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods.
Obviously, people are entitled to their own opinions. They're not entitled to their own facts, and I think there are actual scientific realities that are being ignored by some in this debate.
Well, I think you have to look at who's doing the study. All the studies that Iberdrola is doing, they're doing themselves. They hire their own hydrologists, they hire their own forestry people, they hire their own bear guy, they do all their own studies, and then they present it to the Public Service Board.
Historically, at the Public Service Board, no non-developer experts have ever mattered. You know, they refuse to even entertain the idea of anyone else's expert advice.
But it would be pulsating or peaking at a frequency of like that same 1 second. So it would go like shh, shh, shh.
I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about people who are sound experts with 30-year history and written, published articles and, books and everything. I mean, these are true experts, and they just dismiss you like you don't know what you're talking about.
Most of the information they're getting is just anecdotal. It's not really researched, authentic information.
You could go through the list of all the issues that get raised, and oftentimes they get blown significantly out of proportion. You're talking about very minor impacts that get painted as catastrophic.
For a while, Grafton resident Randy Lockerbie was unsure if he could get behind building Vermont's largest wind farm in his town.
But like anything, there's pros and cons to everything.
He says some of his neighbors are worried about the environmental impacts this project could cause and the eyesore it would create on the scenic mountain ridges in Grafton and nearby Windham. Lockerbie says they're getting pushy.
I don't like being told how to be. And that's what these people are trying to do. They're trying to persuade everybody.
We just keep bringing our story out and letting people know that if they are close to their houses, more kids are going to be harmed.
This is my family. We're from Sheffield. We have our closest tower is just a little over 3/4 of a mile away. I brought these studies here. And these are just a few of the studies that say that these things make you sick.
We're not considered the experts. We just live here.
So what we have to do is work as hard as possible to keep making the point that it's a bad idea for our towns, it's a bad idea for our state.
And we invited people to just come look, come see what was happening. Because a large part of it was educating people, that they had to be learning not just what the wind companies were saying. We wanted them to also learn the impact it would have, so they would be making a reasonable judgment.
They're taking other people's. They're not going out and doing the research themselves. Go to UBLE, talk to the Chamber of Commerce, find out how much house prices have gone up or down. What is the tax base like? How many people are ill? How many piles of dead birds do they find underneath each of these things? Has the wildlife all gone away? Ask the questions of the people themselves who actually are living it, not things you read online.
In the communities, people are waking up, which is making the industry more upset, and their propaganda is increasing.
We're slowly gaining an upper edge. They know they're in the wrong. You got little guys like us just poking and jabbing. That's all we can do. And I think our message is slowly coming across.
Look at the sky, Goliath. The vultures augur ill for thee.
Right here, in our sweet little republic, with a gold-domed state house whose doors are unlocked and unguarded, where any citizen can stroll on in and knock on the office door of the governor or sit in on just about any legislative meeting they wish to. Even here, some people are feeling unheard and disrespected, stepped on by Goliath corporations, and sacrificed in the name of green energy. So what's going on here? I know a number of our legislators on a personal, even a close friendship level. They're not just good people, they're great people, with hearts as golden as the dome itself. As our federal government has pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, we actually have folks in Montpelier who are trying to make us leaders in a green energy future. But there's still something about how we've been going about building renewables that hasn't been working. People are angry, making it impossible for us to move forward in a unified way. That brought our legislature in June of 2016 to Senate Bill 260, aka Act 174, aka the Energy Development Improvement Act. The burning question S260 seeks to resolve is, who decides our green energy future? Local towns and regions, or the State House?
Decisions about if and when renewable energy is built, or any energy project, should be made at the state level. That is something that we have had as a principle in Vermont for decades, and it is for very good reason. These are resources that benefit the state as a whole, and just like transmission lines, for instance, we do not want to be in a situation where one town can say, no, this isn't appropriate. Number one, towns don't have the expertise. Number two, they necessarily have a perspective that is about what they perceive to be in the best interest of their town as opposed to the best interest of the state.
So Vermont does have a very strong tradition of local democratic control via town meetings and also through the general spirit that's set at the legislature. It's called the People's House, and Vermont has a long tradition of independence from the rest of the United States. But in the case of wind power and other forms of electricity development, were specifically separated out and put under something called Section 248, which removes them from local control. And so the wind power permitting process in Vermont is essentially a loophole in the local democratic control of decision-making in Vermont.
It needs to be a state-driven process with local color added. And that's what we, in theory, have, and in some cases I think it's worked quite well. In other cases, we have communities that don't believe the local color has been added appropriately.
We're facing a very serious oncoming climate crisis. We have to marshal solutions that are really going to make a difference. And if we push ridgeline wind in particular, it's going to give renewable energy a very bad name. So it's going to generate a lot of public resistance. So it's not only very damaging to the environment, but it also threatens the entire development of sustainable renewable energy in this region.
And the way that we've been doing this now is causing a backlash and causing people to say, no more, stop, make it stop. You know, renewable energy is just bad.
The result is a grassroots rebellion against Vermont's energy policies. The rebellion has spread to dozens of towns across Vermont, and I believe it will continue to spread.
And what we're struggling to do is really get that right balance of local contributions to the decision making.
The legislature passed a law this year that will give communities and regions a significantly greater say in the permitting of renewable energy projects.
What we tried to do was say, okay, we want communities to be aggressive in fighting climate change, but if they can determine a way to achieve the goals that meets some of the local flavor, that's fine. But we can't allow a very small number of people in some instances to just shut down Vermont's overall efforts. And so S260 tried to engage communities to say, all right, we might be able to all solve our contribution in a different way, but you have to be working on solving it, and that was the attempt to do it.
The renewable energy siting bill that just passed, we sincerely hope creates a situation where there is more ownership of our state renewable energy goals at the town level. The towns are actually actively thinking about where do we want these things, where do we not want these things, and because those plans will have so much weight in determining where and when renewable energy is built, that it creates a situation where we can all have that calm conversation that at least we would like to have.
Now, I serve on both a regional planning commission and a municipal planning commission, and so I'm watching how this plays out, and it's not playing out well. I've reviewed 10 of the 11 draft plans, and this is not something that the industry knows, but 6 of them say no industrial wind. 6 out of 11 regional plans that are in the draft phase say no to industrial wind.
So the new legislation gives significant say, though not final say, to regional planning commissions in Vermont. We'll see where that takes us. Now to the final twist in this story. Numerous anti-big wind folks I've talked to made the claim that if we really want to reduce our carbon emissions, then electricity generation is the wrong place to focus. After all, we Vermonters tend to drive a lot, and the gas we burn for transportation accounts for about 45% of our total emissions, while heating our homes with fossil fuels makes up another 21% of the total. Our electricity use is only about 11%. So even if we manage to produce all our electricity with renewables, we'd only make a small dent in our actual carbon emissions as a state. Our focus as a state has been on electric efficiency, which means that we should need less and less electricity, and thus less need to clear ridgelines to plant wind turbines, right? Once again, the story grows more complex.
Today, freedom and power are woven together. The invisible battalions of electric power turn out autos and airplanes, household goods and guided missiles to preserve our freedoms for the greater world to come. But we are not a nation of destroyers. We are builders. Builders of new freedoms and more power for a new age. We stand on the edge of that new age even now, and the pioneering spirit, flowering in the air of freedom, will dream and build new ways to put electric power to work.
10 years from now, we're going to be moving most of our energy consumption to electricity. And if we're going to meet our goals as a state to reach 90% renewables by 2050, we absolutely have to find a way to create that electricity using renewables.
The best strategy to reduce the use of fossil fuel powered electricity is to use less electricity. The problem now is the thinking has shifted. There's actually a desire for more consumption of electricity as long as it's powered from renewable sources.
So looking into the future, over time, we will get rid of most of those liquid fuels, the fossil fuels, and we'll convert to electricity. So we're going to have to build our electric supply by at least 3 times over what it is.
From a climate change point of view, the primary problem is vehicles, not my residence or yours. It's vehicles. It's about half the pollution problem.
Also through our building heating, both residential and commercial, a lot of fossil fuel consumption there. And as we move forward, there's increasingly more and more electrification. People are very familiar with electric vehicles, but we're also seeing that on the building heating side through heat pump technology.
It's hard to know precisely how much electric power we're going to be using, because so much electrification is likely to occur in the coming couple decades.
I think in the next 10 years, we will definitely be seeing sort of a dramatic shift of not only personal vehicles, but commercial vehicles as well, over to electric technologies with the decrease in battery costs, more access to charging stations becoming sort of commonplace everywhere we go.
We need to have an actual plan about how we will engage with the electrification of the vehicle fleet.
As we move increasingly more and more to electricity and the need for renewables, renewables are very intermittent in nature. Wind only works when the wind is blowing, solar only works when the sun is shining, and we need electricity for our vehicles and our homes and all of these other things all the time. So those are some big challenges.
When you look at integrating renewables into an electric system, we have to change the system. That's what smart grid is supposed to be.
You know, the sort of traditional model of having a central generation plant followed by a series of substations and transmission that runs out to distribution lines to people. That system we've seen to be very fragile.
The new model and distributed and renewable system is all your generation is everywhere, and they have to be two-way streets. It's not a central one-way street. And that's the change.
You have the end user potentially producing, putting back in a much more sort of dynamic system.
The utility industry and the leaders still do not understand that's what smart grid's supposed to do.
And of course, unless everybody was planning on putting in little mini coal plants at their homes, this is going to really translate to small-scale wind, small-scale solar.
As some of these other technologies are deployed, especially with the term distributed generation taking more hold, we'll probably see more effective, smaller generating resources of the kind that probably raise fewer concerns from the public.
We're taught bigger is better, and bigger isn't always better.
I would like to see it move forward the way a lot of the wind resistors are people who are resisting the industrial scale.
Produce the renewable energy at a very local, small scale that is not an industrial scale.
We need to focus on home-based microgrids, and the truth of the fact is the utilities don't want that because it compromises their industry.
So why is it that these states are emphasizing ridgeline wind so much and not something like solar power? And I think the reason is because the utility companies can control and profit from large-scale wind. And I think they're terrified of a really viable distributed solar power movement that could potentially come in and remove their dominance over the electricity supply.
We don't have the luxury of choosing wind or solar or wind or efficiency. It's often painted as an either or, and we really are in a situation where we need both and we need all of it very quickly. So when I hear people suggest, oh, we should just do rooftop solar, we should just invest more in efficiency, when you actually look at the scope of the problem that we're facing and how quickly we need to get off of fossil fuels, we need to do wind and solar and cow power and landfill gas power and efficiency and conservation. We need to do all of them right now.
The good news is we can do this. We have the technology to do this today. We have, on home heating, we have heat pumps. On the transportation side, we have electric vehicles with batteries getting better and better every single day. On the generation side, we have solar energy, abundant solar energy, and increasingly more efficient solar panels. It is happening now, and it's accelerating very rapidly, and we just need to come together to really make this a reality. Within 10, 15 years, there's no reason to believe that we can't all be living more full, abundant lives with renewables so that we don't need to utilize fossil fuels anymore.
So the question, how do we reach our goal by 2050 of getting 90% of our energy from renewable sources? That question absolutely hinges on the generation of electricity. If we are going to heat our homes and power our electric cars, then we will need to produce a lot more electricity. We'll need to produce it without fossil fuels, and we'll need a grid that can move all that intermittent power around in new ways. How will we do that and care for our fragile wilderness areas and protect the health of our people and preserve our proud history of people power? When I began this adventure, I assumed the answer was a simple one. Every person I met as I traveled around our Green Mountain state cares deeply about Vermont and about this fragile home that we all share. They also reminded me that there is no such thing as a simple answer. Still, I look at my boys and I know that we need to tackle the complex challenges so that they inherit a thriving planet. What can we learn from our turbulent history with ridgeline wind projects? How can we succeed in a way that unites us Vermonters around a clean energy future rather than causing many to reject renewable energy projects wholesale? In other words, how do we go about saving the planet in a way that enhances rather than destroys the character of Vermont?
And silver waters are my home. They belong to me and to all of her sons and daughters. May they be strong and forever free. Let us live to protect her beauty and look with pride on the golden dome. They say home is where the heart is. These green mountains are my home. These green mountains are my home. I've met so many people, but I don't know anyone anymore. And I'm tired of playing all these games. Please free me from this bitter bind. Lay here with me under this old oak tree and let the warm breeze blow. Oh, just lay here with me. It's not easy breathing in this salty air when you leave me bare. These tides of change I've grown to love will
Vermont PBS, partnering with local filmmakers to bring you stories made here. For more, visit vermontpbs.org.